Napoleon III and Empress Eugénie looked like the perfect couple, but behind bedroom doors they had a bombshell secret. The emperor was one of the most notorious womanizers in France, and his conquests included famous actresses, models, and heiresses. Eugénie had to turn a blind eye to her husband's countless infidelities, but that wasn't the whole story. There was an even more scandalous reason that husband and wife never shared a bed. Napoleon III, aka Charles Louis, Napoleon Bonaparte, was the subject of controversy before he was even born. His father Louis was the brother of the Napoleon, like the one in the cool paintings that you've actually heard of. Louis rode his brother's coattails for years, eventually becoming the King of Holland. Napoleon III's mother, Hortense, was the only daughter of this Napoleon's first wife, Josephine, from her first marriage. For anyone not keeping track, that means Napoleon Bonaparte's brother married his stepdaughter. Even more bizarre, it was all Josephine's idea. She was infertile and knew she could never provide Napoleon with an heir. The next best thing, apparently, was to marry her daughter to her brother-in-law, so they could make an heir. And you thought your family was nuts. It turned out that marrying your stepdad's brother isn't all it's cracked up to be, and the couple couldn't stand each other. As a result, Napoleon III endured a tense childhood torn between his fighting parents, but at least his uncle seemed to like him. The last time uncle and nephew ever saw each other was at a family gathering, right before Napoleon marched off to the Battle of Waterloo. After his catastrophic defeat in 1815, the new French regime forced all of the Bonapartes into exile, until Napoleon went from the lap of luxury in Paris to life on the run. The family spent time in Switzerland, Germany, and Italy before returning to Paris in 1831, not long after the reign of King Charles VI had ended. The new king, Louis-Philippe, allowed the Bonapartes to stay in Paris temporarily as long as they remained incognito. Within a month, most of the city knew where Napoleon and his mother were staying. On May 5th, the 10th anniversary of Napoleon Bonaparte's death, mourners packed the streets in front of their hotel. It was a gesture that filled Napoleon III with pride and hope, but it was also the last thing they needed. The new king couldn't have a Bonaparte in Paris turning people against him. Napoleon III left Paris a changed man. His name had always weighed heavy on him, but his time in the city gave him a new perspective. He saw how much people loved his uncle, and he became convinced that he could march on Paris and that the people would rise up to support him. After a failed attempt at a coup in Strasbourg, he once again had to flee France. He traveled to London and then to Brazil before finally ending up in New York City. There he mingled with the American cultural elite. The name Napoleon still opened plenty of doors. After a time in the Big Apple, he set off to explore America, but didn't get very far before he received a letter from his mother. Her health had taken a turn for the worse, and she didn't have much time. He dropped everything and hurried back to Europe to say goodbye to his mother. It wasn't long before Napoleon's thoughts returned to seizing power in France. In 1840, he bought weapons and uniforms and gathered about 60 men to march with him. It wasn't much, but Napoleon figured he didn't need much of a force. He'd just show up in France, and the people would rejoice at a returning Bonaparte. His grand invasion of France didn't even make it off the beach. They arrived on French shores where customs agents immediately stopped them. They had hoped the local garrison would rally to their cause, but that didn't happen. The garrison surrounded Napoleon's men on the beach. After a tense standoff in which one of Napoleon's men died, the locals apprehended all of the mutineers. The press made him a laughingstock, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. But it's not like the French king locked him up in a dank cell. He had guards, but he still had a surprising amount of freedom. He was even able to shack up with a local woman named Eleanor. He fathered 2 children with her while biding his time and planning his next move. Napoleon knew Napoleon III to be a notorious womanizer. His most infamous conquests included Eliza Rachel Felix, the most famous actress in Europe, and the Countess of Castelloni, the first supermodel. And that barely scratches the surface. Napoleon III kept himself busy in captivity, but that doesn't mean he was satisfied. The press could ridicule him all they wanted, but he knew deep down that the people of France adored him and were waiting for his return. In 1840, when his uncle Napoleon Bonaparte's body returned to Paris to much celebration and fanfare, Napoleon III's confidence only grew. On May 25, 1846, Napoleon, disguised as a laborer, simply walked out of prison. He walked right up to his getaway carriage, which took him to the English Channel. From there he sailed to England, where he started his plans for another insurrection. In July, Napoleon learned that his father had died in Italy. Through his grief, he saw an opportunity. With his father gone, Napoleon was now the clear, unopposed heir to the Bonaparte dynasty. Although the Bonaparte name still held weight, Napoleon III needed real cash if he ever hoped to return to France. Well, his latest mistress, Harriet Howard, was one of the wealthiest women in England. She must have adored Napoleon because she soon allowed him to move in with her, taking in his 2 illegitimate children and raising them as her own. Harriet Howard was the bankroll for Napoleon's ambitions back in France, and after years of failed coups and public embarrassment, his time had finally arrived. The restoration of the French monarchy didn't last too long. In 1848, the people rebelled yet again, forcing the king to abdicate his throne. Napoleon saw the moment he had been waiting for. He immediately set out for Paris and arrived to find the Second Republic had taken over. And factions were all vying for power under the new regime, making it the perfect time to begin his political career. Napoleon arrived humbly, telling the new provisional government that he was without any other ambition than that of serving his country. He did not get the response he hoped for. The provisional government told him to beat it. The last thing they needed was a Bonaparte in Paris, stirring up even more chaos. Napoleon, by now having learned patience, returned to England and waited for things in France to settle down. He soon realized that he'd made an excellent decision. It meant that his hands remained clean of the bloodshed that was coming. The Dune Days uprising saw insurgents rise up against the provisional government. Paris turned into a war zone. Barricades soon filled the streets, and by the time the fighting stopped, thousands lay dead. Napoleon III's nephew to France's greatest hero had been in London the whole time. Many in the new government were tainted, but his hands remained clean. After the uprising, France held elections for the National Assembly. Napoleon III ended up on the ballot for 13 different departments, and he was elected in 5, receiving more votes than any other candidate. By the end of the year, France held a presidential election. Napoleon III was the name on everyone's lips by then, and he won in a remarkable landslide. He received a whopping 74.2% of the vote. Everyone loved him, from peasants to workers to small business owners to intellectuals like Victor Hugo. Finally, after facing his entire life, Napoleon had what he had always wanted. He was president of France, but that wasn't good enough. According to the new constitution, he had to step down at the end of his term. His uncle wouldn't have accepted limits like that, and he wouldn't either. He quickly sought out an amendment that would allow him to succeed himself at the end of the term. He managed to get a surprising number of votes, but he didn't get the 2/3 majority he needed. When his vote failed, he did something drastic, a coup d'etat. Along with his senior officers, he got to work on the night of December 1st, 1851. They occupied key strategic points across the city and plastered the streets with posters. These posters said that Napoleon had dissolved the National Assembly. New elections were to take place, and Paris would remain occupied until then. Napoleon was done playing fair. Even some of his own supporters couldn't support the coup. Several Republicans tried to organize a resistance, but Napoleon responded swiftly and brutally. They swept through the city and crushed any insurgents they found. By the end of the day, Somewhere between 300 and 400 rebels lay dead on the streets. A period of intense political repression followed. He had 26,000 people apprehended. Many of them had their property confiscated and were forced to leave France. Napoleon shipped the unluckiest ones off to a penal colony in French Guiana. For a self-proclaimed man of the people, Napoleon III was acting like a tyrant. It wasn't enough to write a new, remarkably authoritarian constitution. Napoleon III saw himself as heir to Napoleon Bonaparte, and Napoleon Bonaparte was no president. After embarking on a national tour and basking in the adulation of the people, Napoleon made it official. He was the Emperor of the French. Critics had ridiculed him for years, but they weren't laughing now. As an emperor, he now needed a wife who could bring political alliances. He started sending letters to the families of all of Europe's most eligible princesses, inquiring about marriage. Most of the families he contacted gave him a flat no. They knew that France had been hanging on the edge of anarchy for decades. It seemed like only a matter of time before yet another revolution ripped Napoleon III off his throne. He ended up settling for a minor Spanish countess, Eugénie de Montijo. But the countess wasn't like the actresses and heiresses he'd spent his life seducing. When he tried to take her to bed, she rebuffed him, demanding they wait for marriage. Napoleon, the most insatiable man in Europe, wasn't happy about it. Despite their differences, they married in 1853. Not long after, they welcomed a son, another bloody Napoleon. From there, Eugénie took up the ceremonial role of Empress. She entertained guests at the palace, joined Napoleon at balls and other public events, and represented him when he left the country. While Eugénie had done pretty much everything Napoleon could have expected, and more, that wasn't enough to keep him faithful. As soon as he had an heir to the throne, he ditched his wife and returned to philandering. If women were Napoleon III's #1 bad habit, smoking like a chimney was definitely #2. He lit up first thing in the morning, then just kept smoking for pretty much the entire day. Anyone who entered his rooms learned this right away. People hung in the air at all times, clinging to the extravagant art, furniture, and draperies that decorated his chambers. Napoleon III gained his throne mostly through charisma, with a healthy amount of nepotism thrown in for good measure. That's a great way to rise to power, but not great for keeping it. As the years of his reign wore on, his grasp on France started slipping. Opposition to his authoritarian policies grew across every political sphere, and he couldn't rely on the blanket support of the people anymore. Due to his unhealthy lifestyle and disdain for doctors, his ailments started piling up. He started walking with a cane and soon couldn't even mount a horse anymore. Napoleon III was no longer the kind of man who instilled much confidence. By 1869, Napoleon could add urinary tract problems to his ever-growing list of maladies. The treatment was opium, which came with some troubling side effects. He became lazy, lethargic, and apathetic to the world around him. Lord Malmesbury had known Napoleon III since his days in exile in England. Malmesbury must have been excited to see his old friend, now an emperor, but he didn't like what he found when he arrived in Paris. Malmesbury instantly realized that Napoleon was terribly changed and very ill. The man who had fought tooth and nail for the throne was gone. Unfortunately, France needed that man because Napoleon III's greatest enemy was gaining power on the horizon. Just as France's leader grew frail and ineffective, its rival Prussia found itself a strapping new chancellor named Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck had grand plans for Prussia, and he planned to achieve them by iron and blood. Napoleon III stood in the way of those plans, and Bismarck knew weakness when he saw it. Once Napoleon had exhausted every diplomatic option, he realized he had no choice. Bismarck wanted iron and blood, and he was going to get it. Although Napoleon's body was already wasting away, he decided to lead his men from the front lines. The Franco-Prussian conflict was just one misstep after the other, all leading to the catastrophic Battle of Sedan. Napoleon's forces just weren't up to the task of taking on the elite Prussians. When the dust settled that day, the French had lost 17,000 men. The Prussians captured 21,000 more, including Napoleon III himself. Reports of Napoleon's actions during the Battle of Sedan are truly disturbing. As the battle grew more and more hopeless, the anguished emperor wandered around aimlessly out in the open as shells rained down all around him. As his doctor grimly put it in his diary, "If this man has not come here to kill himself, I don't know what he has come to do. I have not seen him give an order all morning." Napoleon III and his wife never got along well, but her reaction to his loss was particularly cold-hearted. When she heard the news, she shouted, "An emperor does not capitulate. Doesn't he know he has dishonored himself?" Soon angry crowds formed outside the palace, furious at Napoleon III's humiliation. The Empress slipped out a side door and fled to England. After everything he accomplished, Napoleon III was nothing more than a scapegoat in the end. The newly elected assembly removed him from power and placed the blame for France's loss at his feet. They arranged a peace with Prussia, and with Napoleon III suitably neutered, Bismarck let the disgraced emperor walk free. After his release from Prussia, he had no money to his name and could find no support anywhere. He had to pawn the clothes and jewels on his back just to afford safe passage to England. Once he arrived, he entertained no new plans for invasion or rebellion. He just wasted away until he died after complications from surgery, but not before uttering his final words. As his breathing slowed on January 9, 1873, he clung to his attendant and asked, "Were you at Sedan?" When the man said he was, Napoleon III continued, "Isn't it true that we weren't cowards at Sedan?" Napoleon Bonaparte was one of the most uniquely brilliant people in history, and Napoleon III couldn't live up to him. However, many of his critics pointed to the same reason to explain why Napoleon III failed. His obsession with womanizing was so all-encompassing that it seriously affected his ability to rule. But, as far as Napoleon III saw it, he had no other choice. The man was addicted to intimacy, yet he couldn't get any of that from his wife. Eugénie found sleeping with her husband to be, in her words, disgusting. After they had a child, it's very likely that she never let him touch her again. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.